Hi everyone, my name is Brianne Haley-Killeen, and it is an absolute honor to be sitting here with John Quiñones. John, can you give me a little bit of an introduction about who you are?
I'm from San Antonio, Texas. I've been a reporter at ABC 40 years, ever since I was 8 years old.
Yeah.
My dream was to work at ABC, and here I am after all these years, still happy. And then I created this show called What Would You Do?
I'm sure they all know about that
Which
one.
is, the hidden camera show about
Yeah.
ethics and morals. So that's what I do, and that's who I am.
Can you tell me a little bit about where it all started? Because growing up, you did something that was completely different with your family.
Yeah, we were migrant farm workers. When I was 13, we picked tomatoes in Ohio and cherries in Michigan. My dad was a janitor, and my mom used to clean houses on the rich part of town. They spoke no English, and neither did I or my two sisters when we first went to school. It was tough. And in San Antonio, when you grew up in the barrio, in the poor community, the west side of San Antonio, you didn't have to learn English. But it was tough because I wanted to be a journalist, and I dreamed of someday traveling. So the dream seemed far out of reach. But I never stopped believing. No one would hire me in television. It was really frustrating and depressing for a number of years. But I met someone who had gone to Columbia University. I'd never heard of Columbia University in Texas. The only time I'd been out of the state was to pick tomatoes and cherries. And I told her my story. I said, I'm going to give up journalism. I'm going to go to law school or try to get into law school. And she said, no, don't. You have such a passion for telling stories, I can tell. She introduced me to Columbia, and I applied, and I wrote 2 essays based on my life, and they accepted me. And after that, I got a job in Chicago as a local TV reporter.
Okay, so you went from migrant farming to living the absolute dream.
Yeah, it's been wonderful. I mean, it wasn't always easy, and I also drew upon my being Hispanic. For example, one of the first big stories that I did in Chicago as a local TV reporter was to go undercover and pose as a Mexican immigrant trying to get into the U.S. So I convinced my boss, my news director in Chicago, to let me go to Mexico and pretend that I was just another immigrant trying to get into the U.S. And I found a coyote, a smuggler, who for $300 put me on an inner tube, and I floated across the Rio Grande, telling the story of what are the push factors that make immigrants, risk their lives to come to this country to get a job as a dishwasher or a roofer for very little money. How desperate must they be? And then not only that, I didn't stop crossing the river. I got a job in Chicago, because remember, this was for the Chicago station. Yeah. So I went to a restaurant where we had heard that the owner of that restaurant had 7 Mexican immigrants, undocumented, working for him, and he had not paid them in 17 weeks. And every time they complained, he would say, hey guys, you get to sleep here in the basement, you get to eat all the food you want. So I went to that place, and I got a job as a dishwasher. He thought I was just another Mexicano, and he hires me, and that night I slept down in the basement with all the other guys, and I pulled out a little camera, and I started interviewing them in Spanish about their lives. And through tears, they told me how they were being held as virtual slaves in that restaurant. And the next day I came back, and this time wearing a suit, speaking fluent English, with a camera crew behind me. And I remember we had to chase the owner of the restaurant through the parking lot because he didn't want to talk to me about what he was doing to those men. But the day after my story aired, the U.S. government moved in. They shut down the restaurant, and they arrested the owner, and they got the Mexican workers the money they were owed and temporary visas to remain in this country while they worked on their residency. So ABC, once I got my Emmy, that was my first Emmy award, ABC News called from New York, and they hired me to go to Miami to cover Latin America.
Wow.
That was my job.
Oh my gosh. That's one of the most beautiful things about journalism, is being able to bring justice to certain communities and people going through such distress, and being able to bring light to all these detrimental things that are happening in the community, because let's face it, we're not living in a perfect world.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's one thing that I'm really looking forward to, being able to move into the career of journalism, is being able to shed light on these issues that are happening and give people the justice that they deserve. So it's awesome to see, because that's a really extreme large scale example, but it's exciting. And I think my generation coming in, the new up-and-coming generation, while the industry is changing and it's going through, it's changing from linear, and now it's people aren't reading much newspaper, they're not watching as much TV, so now it's more social media, maybe some website. What advice would you give?
I'm a little worried that the source where the younger generation is getting their news is not very legitimate, because you never know who's posting what on the internet.
Yeah.
So that's a little disconcerting. I'm a little worried that your generation doesn't watch a lot of television. Maybe you do, because you're in this, you're pursuing this career. But a lot of young folks, I don't know where they get their news. And if it's from the internet, it's disturbing. You got to consider the source of your information. At ABC, we have lawyers to confirm what we're saying. That's precious.
And it's funny because my friends don't do it on purpose. It's just because people in my generation are so absorbed in their cell phones and social media that that's how they're getting their news, just naturally. That's what's organic for them. For generations before, what was organic is you walk outside and you get the newspaper. And my friends will tell me some things that they see on TikTok with certain stories that I know ABC is covering or WABC is covering, and they'll just spit out these absurd details. And I'm like, I don't think that happened, but I'll double check, and then I'll be at work like texting them like, that was completely fake. That did not happen. Whoever, said that on TikTok.
Yeah, you got to consider the source. And then people badmouth journalists. That affects our credibility. And as a reporter, all you have is your credibility.
Yeah.
So I'm a little worried about that. My advice is read as much as you can, but always, always consider the source of your information. And I would say just try to work for an organization where they put a premium on facts.
Like, you can always see when reporters are telling the story, and I've noticed, watching news with different channels growing up, some of them show more bias than others, some of them are more politically affiliated than others.
Yeah.
But being in the newsroom and seeing things reported firsthand in front of me, it's very neutral. It's like, this is what's happening on this side, this is what's happening on this side, and take it as you please.
Exactly. You know, that's what I tell the folks all the time. Please don't brush us all with the same stroke, because it is different here. I can swear to you, all my career at ABC, I'm very proud of it. And sometimes we don't like the lawyers at ABC interfering with my script, my story. But it's good that they're there, because they keep us honest. And the other problem in news these days is that too many people are giving their opinion. In the old days, they would label commentary or editorial at the end of the broadcast when some anchorman was talking about his personal view of something. You should know when it's his personal view. Now, people are confused. They watch some reporters and some anchors who are spouting this information and sometimes take a stand on something, and the audience doesn't always know. Because the audience too often is now, these days, more than ever, going to different silos. They go to a place that only confirms what they already believe. Instead of opening up your mind, for Christ's sakes, and considering all sides of the story before deciding.
Speaking of these silos and some stations being more politically biased or affiliated, somebody like me who's up and coming and will be looking for a position once the internship is over and I'm graduated.
I'm proud of you. Good for you.
Thank you. Let's say it's the competition and getting a position as a reporter and as an anchor at an entry level is very hard. But let's say opportunities open up and an entry-level person like me up and coming gets an opportunity at a station that's politically affiliated. How do you go about that, being that getting opportunities in this industry is very hard, so you kind of want to take what you can get, and let's say it is a station that is kind of biased. Do you go in and you try to make a difference, or do you try to wait for another opportunity somewhere else?
You can take the job, but please stick to your convictions.
Okay.
You don't have to cause a lot of waves, but you don't need to conform to everything they want you to say. Because again, all we have as journalists is our credibility. It should always be the story first. We want to make the world a better place by exposing wrongdoing. And if people don't believe that what you're exposing is true because in the past you've told lies, then that ain't going to work.
Yeah, no, actually it's funny because in my leadership class we were talking about different types of power that build leaders into whatever type of leader that they are. And so we were talking a lot. Every class time we start with referent power. And so that really ties into it is your referent power. And once that's kind of chipped away, even a little bit, it's very, very, very hard to build that back up.
The beautiful thing about working at a network is that you have producers working with you.
Yeah.
He or she is checking things out and making sure and double checking that the information I'm getting is true.
Just for a second, I want you to give a little bit of advice on how to pitch stories and how to find them, because I feel like that's something that I also struggle with, and I'm sure a lot of other entry-level journalists might be struggling with, is finding news before it's already covered.
Well, I would tap the sources in your own community that are not getting covered. In those communities, you might be able to get stories that someone from the outside would not be able to do. So just keep an open mind. Stand on a corner and look around. Don't expect someone to bring you a story and give you a story. Be observant. Don't worry so much about talking to the movers and shakers of the world. Talk instead to the moved and the shaken.
Yeah, well, your show, what would you do, is surrounded, around the heroes in the community and who's going to step in instead of just being a bystander in situations like that. So that's interesting how it took a turn. You were covering news in these countries, and now it's like you've created a show that sends that message out in itself. So that's super interesting. Just now, you mentioned a couple skills that somebody should have coming into the industry: being open-minded, being able to listen, mouth closed a little bit more, keep the ears open. That's I used to talk so much when I was little. My mom she instilled in me the last few years, like you need to listen more than you speak because it's important. So what other core skills do you think somebody should have coming into the industry?
Don't be shy. That's important. And not being afraid to ask questions.
What would you say your favorite story was, and what was the biggest lesson you took away from it?
I think the one you mentioned earlier, where I was in Colombia, South America, covering another story, and I looked out my window at the hotel because the other story wasn't much of a story, but I saw some children on the streets at night, and they would steal necklaces from women and watches from men during the day, and then they would open up the manhole covers and climb down into the sewer systems. And I asked the woman who worked for us, who are those kids? And she said, they're called gamines. They're street children, runaways, castaways, kids nobody wants. They're homeless, and there's about 300 of them, and they live in the sewers of Bogota, next to the rivers of waste of 20 million people. Can you imagine that? And I said, wow. I said, is anyone trying to help them? She said, well, the government's trying to clean up the streets of Bogota. So what they do is they open up the manhole covers on the streets, those circular metal things. They don't want to go down there and chase the kids because they're afraid. These kids control that dark world down there. So they don't want to go down there, but what they do is they pour gasoline down there and throw a match and try to burn them out. And I couldn't believe it. And she said, many of the kids have been burned. And I said, is anyone trying to help them? She said, there's one guy. His name is Jaime Jaramillo. And he's a wealthy industrialist who finds oil for American oil companies in Latin America. But at night, he can't sleep knowing that there are children who live in these conditions. So he goes down there, he opens up the manhole cover, he puts on some waders and a mask and a cat, and he takes a loaf of bread and a bucket of chicken and a six-pack of soft drinks, and he does what he can to rescue the children of the sewers. So I said, I got to meet this guy. And I met him, and he showed me photographs of what he found down there. And I said, can you take us down there? And he said, yeah, but you got to go with me because these kids don't trust anyone else. And we went into the sewers, and we spent a week down there filming these children. I met a little girl who was 16 who had just given birth to a baby in the sewers. Once we came back, we brought it to New York, and we put it on a few weeks later on Primetime Live. The story aired, and American viewers sent in $1 million in donations to Jaime Jaramillo, so he was able to open up the orphanage that he wanted to open for these kids. He pulled everyone out of the sewers, and they're now living, in an orphanage. It's beautiful, and it was because we shined the light of that camera on that story.
Yeah. So with this story and a bunch of the other stories that you've done, came with a lot of risk taking. So being entry level and students up and coming into the industry should be taking risks, no matter the scale of the risk, but just getting out of their comfort zone. your motto in that masterclass was, don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness. That's what it was. And you were talking about one of the stories that you did. So can you just talk a little bit about the importance of getting out of your comfort zone and being okay with being uncomfortable and taking those risks?
It's really important. You got to be careful, of course, and really check out the situation. The adrenaline starts flowing and you want to get the story. You do push the envelope sometimes. It's a thin line between pushing the envelope and getting the story and going in and getting something exclusive that no one else is getting because you're brave enough to do that. A thin line between that and risking your life.
I'm glad that you said that, because being a young professional, you want to say yes to everything.
Yeah,
you don't want to disappoint, and you want to shine, and you want to stand out, so you want to say yes to everything.
Don't let that dominate. You got to go with your instinct.
So I kind of just want to segue a little bit. I guess we could agree that maybe your biggest challenge growing up and going to school was the language barrier and the accent.
Yeah.
So when you got settled into your career, what would you say was one of your biggest challenges, and how did you overcome it?
Just getting into college, getting people to take me seriously. And when they keep telling you no, you start believing the no, and it's painful because you think you're never going to get out of there.
How did you go about not knowing what the road ahead was going to be?
I just strongly believed that it would happen. I never thought that I wouldn't make it. It was scary at times, but I kept my eye on the prize, and I just kept asking for new opportunities to let me get there.
I'm okay with dealing with uncertainty to a certain extent, but really not knowing what's going to happen, even as soon as when I graduate, it's like, okay, what's the next step? I don't know yet.
Yeah, well, you're young too. You can afford to.
So we will have to just see where that path kind of goes.
Just keep doing it, and don't listen to the naysayers. Never listen to those who tell you it'll never happen.
Yeah.
Because there's always bitter folks out there who think it didn't happen for them and it may not happen for you. This is totally your experience.
So, and just because I'm curious, how would you say your overall lifestyle or quality of life has changed throughout getting to where you are now? Like being a reporter and going out and telling stories in different countries versus hosting your own show. How has your overall lifestyle changed?
It's all been tremendously exciting. The beautiful thing about being a journalist at this stage in my life is that the variety I get to tell stories. I get a chance to dabble in all kinds of stories, some of them heartbreaking and important, always important, but some of them also a little bit more whimsical.
So in terms of the heartbreaking ones, how did you learn to kind of disconnect and disassociate with the emotions? Because I feel like to a certain extent you have to be emotional, because in the end of the day you're still dealing with somebody's story. You're still talking to people that are going through that hard situation. How did you get through it?
So there were many times when I interviewed too many families, and they're in tears telling you their story. You feel it yourself, and sometimes we need to get therapy ourselves as producers and journalists. We're still human. But what gets me through is knowing that, yes, it might be painful to me listening to their story, not nearly as horrifically painful as it is for them. For now, it might be uncomfortable for me, and sometimes it'll bring me to tears listening to this story. But I keep in mind the greater good that'll come from this, that millions of people are going to watch this interview, and maybe that person will get help and justice. That makes it worthwhile, knowing that by telling their story, as painful as it might be to listen to it, good will come out of it. You'll expose it to millions of viewers.
I like how you brought up the topic of therapy, because I never really thought about journalists or producers or reporters having to get therapy after telling certain stories and heartbreaking stories and just having to deal with all of that emotion. But mental health is so important. And I feel like finally society's talking about it, and people are taking care of their mental health more than maybe they were before, because it was more a taboo. So what are your thoughts on that? Have you seen that change throughout being in the industry from when you started to
Absolutely.
now?
Absolutely, yes. Now, in fact, the new president of ABC News, Kim Godwin, that's big with her, that issue of making sure that those of us who cover stories that are traumatic and emotionally just exhausting, she has made it a mandate to make sure that we all have access to mental health counseling and therapy if we need it.
Yeah.
And that when we need to step away, we step away. And if it means not being on the air for a few months, so be it. You need to be to pace yourself.
Yeah.
Because it can be horrific.
Okay, so is there anything else you'd like to say before we jump off the interview?
We just need the people that we watch telling us the news reflect more of what this country is all about, and we'll be better for it.
Well, I appreciate you sharing all of these stories and all of your experiences and the invaluable wise words. Because
thank you.
There's amazing takeaways from this. So I appreciate your time. Thank you
Of course.
for joining me
Good luck
here.
to you.